Chapter 37. Bug. Amy shook James awake. It was still dark. "Get dressed, now," Amy snapped. "I just had Hewitt on the phone. He's coming to get us." James rubbed his eyes. Amy was on one leg, stepping into a pair of ripped jeans. "What's going on?" "I have no idea," Amy said. "Hewitt said our lives are in danger if we don't get out fast." James put on jeans and trainers. He grabbed his jacket and dashed after Amy. Kathy woke up and asked what was going on. She didn't get an answer. They ran to the bottom of the hill where the BMW was waiting. "Both of you in the back," Hewitt said. The tyres squealed. Hewitt was in a major hurry about something. He threw some medical supplies at Amy. "Give James 4 tablets and 2 shots in the arm. You okay with injections, Amy?" "In theory," Amy said. Branches thrashed the side of the car as it sped down an unlit country lane. "What's wrong with me?" James asked nervously. "Get your coat off," Amy said. She squeezed 4 pills out of their blisters and handed them to James. James looked at the box. It was an antibiotic called ciprofloxacin. "I need water to swallow something," James said. "None here," Hewitt said. "Forgot. Ball up some spit. The faster they're in your system, the better." James's mouth was dry from running. It took a while to get the tablets down. "I can't hold the needle still while the car's moving," Amy said. Hewitt stamped the brakes and pulled into the side of the lane. Amy roughly stabbed James with the first needle. It hurt like hell. "Oh, have you ever done that before?" James asked. Amy didn't answer and punched him with the second jab. Hewitt hit the accelerator. "Will you tell me what the hell is going on?" James shouted. "It wasn't a bomb they were building," Hewitt said. "It was a bioweapon. The radio-controlled cars were carrying cylinders of bacteria." "Oh, God," Amy said. "It's obvious now you say it. Bungle was a microbiology professor. Fire and World studied biology at university. They'd know all about that stuff." "It all fell into place at once," Hewitt said. "The best way to spread a disease through a large building is the air conditioning. I've checked out the van Amy saw. It belongs to a man who services the air conditioning at Greenbrook. Then there was the folder with the RKM logo in Bungle's hut. I thought it was a computer manual, but RKM also makes air conditioners." "What is it?" Amy asked. "The police haven't analysed the cylinders," Hewitt said, "but anthrax is most likely." "Jesus," Amy said. "I don't understand half of what you two are on about," James said. "Can one of you speak to me in English?" "Do you know what anthrax is, James?" Hewitt asked. "No idea, but I'm guessing it's not good, and you think I've got it." "Anthrax is a unique disease. Most diseases can only survive outside your body for about 8 minutes, Hewitt explained. Anthrax can survive in almost any temperature for up to 60 years. That makes it easy to store and use as a weapon. A cupful of anthrax spores in the air could kill hundreds of people." "How did I get it?" James asked. "You might not have it," Hewitt said. "The antibiotics are a precaution. Remember the bright orange box under the bench in the underground workshop?" "Yeah," James said. "It's a sealed disposal unit for toxic waste. You're supposed to incinerate it in a 2,000-degree furnace." "I pulled the lid off and stuck my hand inside," James said. "Unfortunately you did," Hewitt said. "I've got a picture you took of the contents. Gave me a heart attack when I saw it. Looks like the gloves and face masks they used when they were handling the anthrax bacteria ended up in there." "Could I die?" James asked. "I've got to be honest, James. If you breathed the bacteria, you're in trouble. Even with the antibiotics we've given you, there's a 50% death rate." "Could I have given it to Amy or anyone?" James asked. "It's possible some bacteria stuck on your fingers, but the disease is only serious if you breathe thousands of spores. They'll check out Amy at the hospital to be safe." "If I die," James asked, "how long will it take?" "It starts off like the flu, about a day after infection," Most people die within 9 days. What hospital are we driving to? Amy asked. There's a military hospital near Bristol, about 70 kilometres away, Hewitt said. They've got a doctor flying in from Manchester. He knows as much about anthrax as anyone on the planet. 4 nurses in army uniform grabbed James out of the car and stuck him on a trolley, even though he could walk. They burst through doors. Lights on the ceiling whizzed by. James spotted Merrill Spencer and Mac running behind the trolley. They had flown from CHERUB by helicopter. The nurses wheeled James into a huge ward. There were 30 beds in 3 rows, all empty. A male nurse pulled James's trainers and socks off, then grabbed his jeans and boxers down in one. James was embarrassed because Amy, Hewitt, Merrill and everyone was standing around watching. Once James was naked, they lifted him onto a bed. Hello, James. I'm Dr. Cohen. The doctor looked like he'd been dragged out of bed. He wore Nikes, jogging bottoms, and a shirt with the buttons done up in the wrong holes. Has the disease been explained to you? The doctor asked. Mostly, James said. Do I need 30 people standing around looking at me naked? Dr. Cohen smiled. You heard the patient. Everyone but 3 nurses and a couple of doctors headed out. Dr. Cohen continued. First, we need to take blood samples and see if you've been infected with anthrax. However, if you have the disease, your chances of survival decrease with every minute treatment is delayed, so we're going to assume the worst and begin treatment now. A nurse will fix a tube into your arm. We're going to pump you with a mixture of antibiotics and other drugs. Some of the drugs are toxic. Your body will react violently. You can expect vomiting and fever. Amy and Merrill stayed by James's bed. He started feeling weak and shaky a couple of hours after treatment started. His face went pale, and he asked for something to throw up in. Amy went outside looking upset. Merrill gripped his hand. It got worse in the hours that followed. James's stomach and ribcage felt like they were tearing apart. The tiniest movement, even a deep breath or a cough, made his vision blur, and a wave of nausea shoot up from his stomach. The 2 army nurses wiped up every time he got sick. When he got really bad, they injected him with anti-vomiting drugs. The wait for test results was unbearable. James wanted to pass out or fall asleep. He watched the door, silently praying for Dr. Cohen to come back with good news. James wondered if this room might be the last thing he ever saw. Dr. Cohen didn't come back until 8 a.m. on Thursday. It's bad, Dr. Cohen said. We've just got the results from your tests. We'll keep giving you the drugs. Chapter 38. Death. James woke up. He'd been in the hospital for 30 hours. A drip ran up his nose and down into his stomach. Merrill had stayed the whole time. How do you feel? Merrill asked. Weak, James croaked. The tube down his throat made it hard to speak. The doctor says the level of bacteria in your system is going down. The antibiotics are working. What are my chances? James asked. Dr. Cohen said over 80% because the treatment started so early. I feel so rough. I wish I was dead. Lauren's here, Merrill said. Is she okay? Merrill shrugged. Pretty shook up. She waited all day for you to come around. She's sleeping upstairs. Me dying, after Mum and that, James said. She'll be in a right state. Merrill stroked the back of James's hand. You won't die, she said. Fort Harmony has been in all the papers. Headline news. Merrill handed James a Daily Mirror. He could see the giant headline, but his vision was too blurry to read the text. Read it to me, James said. Fort Terror. Britain's oldest hippie commune, Fort Harmony, near Cardiff, was rocked in a stunning raid by anti-terrorist police yesterday. 3 grandsons of the cult writer Gladys Dunn were arrested after anthrax bacteria was found at the nearby Greenbrook Conference Centre. Twins Fire and World Dunn, 22, and their brother Scargill Dunn, 17, were arrested early yesterday morning. Also in custody are Kieran Pym, an air conditioning engineer, and Eleanor Evans. Police are seeking a sixth suspect, Brian Bungle Evans. Police believe he is the ringleader and a founding member of the terrorist group Help Earth. Police also discovered an underground bunker where the deadly cargo was stored before being smuggled into a secure area at Greenbrook. The bunker was not equipped to manufacture the bacteria. A nationwide search has been launched for the high-tech laboratory where the killer bug was bred. It is believed the terrorists were targeting the upcoming Petricon conference at Greenbrook. If anthrax had been successfully used during the conference, most of the 200 oil industry delegates would have been killed, alongside more than 50 Greenbrook staff and bodyguards. More on pages 2, 3, 4 and 11, lottery page 6. "It's the main story on TV," Merrill said. "Bungle's picture was on the cover of every paper. There's all kinds of rumours about where he's gone." "I feel sorry for their little boy," James said. "He's only 3. Matt came into the ward an hour later. Lauren was with him, dressed in pyjamas. She jumped on the bed and gave James a hug. She looked like she'd just heard the funniest joke ever. "There's nothing wrong with you," Lauren squealed. "Thanks for scaring me." "What are you on about?" James asked. "James," Mac said, "have you spoken to Dr. Cohen yet?" James shook his head. "No." "We just found out that the bacteria in your system is harmless," Mac said. "Scargill Dunn claimed they were using a weak strain of anthrax. They were only going to use the bad stuff on the day of the conference. A laboratory in London rechecked your blood sample, and the anthrax inside you couldn't kill a flea." James let out a big smile. "I don't understand," he said. "What's the point of harmless anthrax?" "Bungle only wanted to kill the Petricon delegates," Mac said. "He made the first batch of anthrax with what's called an attenuated strain. It's used in the anthrax vaccine. It makes you immune to the nasty variety. It's been in the air conditioning at Greenbrook Conference Hall for weeks. Security guards, cleaners, catering staff, and anyone else who works regularly in the conference hall would be vaccinated by the time Petricon started. On the first day of the conference, a lethal strain of anthrax was going to be put in the air conditioning, but only the conference guests would get the disease." Dr. Cohen stopped James's antibiotics. By Friday morning, he felt much better. The drip was taken out, and James managed to eat without feeling sick. By Saturday morning, he was almost back to normal. Hewitt drove up from Wales. "Is Amy with you?" James asked. "No, she's back at Fort Harmony, keeping her ear to the ground to see if any information comes through about Bungle. It's not very likely with all that's going on. There are about 50 cops camped out at the bottom of the hill, and loads of huts have got police on the doorstep guarding evidence." "How did Amy explain me disappearing?" "You got into a fight with Amy in the night, ran off, stormed down the road and got run over by some lunatic driving a BMW. Amy lifted you into the car and the driver rushed you to hospital. You lost some blood and you've got a broken arm, but otherwise you're okay. They're keeping you in for observation." "Good story," James said. "I should be allowed out of here today. After all you've been through this week, I'll understand if you want to go back to CHERUB and rest," Hewitt said. "But I'd appreciate it if you could show your face at Fort Harmony for a few days. A week at most." "Will I be allowed to see Joanna?" James asked. "Why not?" Hewitt grinned. "Keep hanging out with Sebastian and Clark. Some little tidbit of information might pop out, but it's mostly to cover Kathy. It would look suspicious if you disappeared on the morning before the arrests, never to be seen again." A nurse fitted James with a plaster cast on his fake broken arm. On the drive back to Wales, James read all the latest stuff in the papers about the anthrax terrorists and the continuing hunt for the laboratory in Bungle. It was odd seeing the newspapers filled with stuff he knew about. The stories made Bungle sound like a supervillain, but James could only remember a big, friendly American who cared about workers' rights and the environment. Kathy was waiting in the Land Cruiser 15 kilometres outside Craddo. James ran between the two cars and waved to Hewitt as he drove off. "Hello, Ross," Kathy said. "Fake broken arm?" James nodded. "It itches exactly like a real broken arm." As they got near the camp, a police officer pulled the Land Cruiser over and asked Kathy where she was going. Kathy got waved on. She had to drive across country because the bottom of the hill near the underground workshop was sealed off by police. The main hut was packed when James and Kathy arrived. The residents seemed edgy about all the police and media hanging around. A few journalists and photographers were scrounging free stew. Amy hugged James when she saw him. James wanted to go down the village and see Joanna, but it was already late, and he didn't know if her dad was home. Sebastian tapped James on the back. "Hey, cripple," Clark said. "Feeling okay?" "Not bad. A bit weak." "You're lucky that driver didn't splatter you," Clark said. "Would have been wicked getting up and seeing you mashed into the road," Sebastian laughed. "Got any scars?" James pulled up the sleeve of his t-shirt and showed the massive bruises and cuts where the antibiotics had been injected. "Is that where the car hit you?" Clark asked. James nodded. "We were going to ask you something the night you got run over," Clark said, "but we couldn't find you." "Ask what?" "If you wanted to sleep over in our hut." "Cool," James said. Chapter 39. Funeral. James couldn't decide if he liked Sebastian and Clark. They had a dark side, but that made them interesting to be around. They slept in a rusty panel van next to their mum's hut. James thumped the metal. Clark slid the side door open. "Get your butt in here!" Clark yelled. James bent over to slip off his boots. It had become habit after a few days at Fort Harmony. "I'll leave them on," Clark said. "The filth is what gives our van character." James stepped inside. 2 gas lamps pushed out gloomy orange light. His hair brushed the roof. Clark's mattress was below the cracked windscreen, where the seats used to be. Sebastian lay at the other end, toying with a big hunting knife. The metal floor was wet and had grass poking up through rust holes. Everything was thrown about. Dirty clothes, air guns, knives, shredded schoolbooks. "Duck!" Sebastian shouted. Sebastian flung his boot across the van. It skimmed past Clark and clanged into the side, leaving a muddy splat on the wall. The second boot hit James in the back. James looked at the muck on his sweatshirt and smiled. "You're so dead," he said. He hurled the boot back, then dived onto Sebastian and squashed him under the cast on his arm. "Bundle!" Clark shouted, and jumped on the pair of them. The 3 boys rumbled until they were all red-faced and out of breath. James was almost as dirty as Sebastian and Clark by the time they'd finished. Clark passed a bottle of water. James took a few gulps and tipped some over his head to cool off. "Want to go out and do something?" Clark asked. James shrugged. "As long as it doesn't involve killing stuff." "Oh, you're such a girl," Clark said. "I want to go down the hill and shoot one of the cops up the arse with my air pistol." Sebastian laughed. "That would be so cool. You haven't got the guts." Clark picked his air pistol off the floor, pumped it, and loaded a pellet. "Want to bet?" "$5," Sebastian said, holding out his hand for Clark to shake. Clark thought about taking the bet, then started laughing. "I knew you wouldn't do it," Sebastian said. "I hate the cops," Clark said. "Fire and World were the best guys around here." "I hope Mum lets us see them in prison this time," Sebastian said. "It would have been superb if they'd pulled it off," Clark said. "We would have been related to 2 of the biggest murderers in British history, and by the time people started getting sick, Fire and World would have been gone. Nobody could have touched them." 200 people dead, though, James said. "They all would have had families and stuff." "They were rich scum," Clark said, "with fat, ugly wives and spoilt kids. The world would have done fine without them." "Ross, you should have heard some of the stuff Fire told us about all the evil shit the big oil companies do," Sebastian said. This farmer in South America had an oil pipe burst over his land. His whole farm was trashed, so he goes to the oil company and asks them to clean up the mess. They beat him up. He complained to the police, but the police were getting bribes from the oil company. They stuck the farmer in a cell and didn't give him anything to drink until he signed a confession saying he blew up the pipe himself. Once he'd signed the confession, he got 50 years in prison. They only let him out when loads of environmentalists complained. That sounds fake, James said. Next time you go on the internet, look it up for yourself, Clark said. There are tons of stories like that on there. Fire told us loads of babies in poor countries die because their drinking water gets poisoned by spilled oil, Sebastian said. Still, you can't go around killing people, James said. You say we're sick, Clark said. So how sick are those guys going to Petrocon? They've all got millions, but they won't spend any of it to stop babies getting poisoned. They decided it wasn't worth going out. You couldn't do much with all the police and journalists around. Clark rigged up a target box at one end of the van, and they had a shooting competition with air guns. James had shot real guns in basic training, and wasn't bad, even though he could only hold the gun with one hand. Sebastian and Clark were brilliant. Every pellet passed through the centre of their paper targets. Afterwards, the brothers showed off tricks. Clark managed to shoot between the eyes of the grinning kids on the cover of his maths textbook while holding the gun behind his back. At midnight, Clark and Sebastian's mum stuck her head in and told them to go to sleep. They rearranged the mess so there was room for James to lay out his sleeping bag and turned out the gas lamps. The boys talked in the dark, mostly about Fire and World. Sebastian and Clark knew tons of funny stories about things Fire and World did at school and in prison. They sounded cool. James almost felt bad about being one of the people who'd got them caught. Somehow they ended up fighting again, battering each other with pillows and throwing stuff around. The darkness made it more exciting because everyone could launch sneak attacks. James's sleeping bag got ripped open in a tug of war, and the stuffing flew everywhere. Clark fired his air pistol. Sebastian and James dived for cover. They couldn't tell if they were being shot at, or if Clark was only trying to scare them. Sebastian and Clark's mum came back. All three boys dived under their covers, giggling. "It's 1 a.m, she shouted. "If I hear any more noise, I'm coming in there and you'll be sorry." Their mum must have been tough, because after she threatened them, Sebastian and Clark straightened up their beds and said goodnight. James was sweaty, filthy, and his burst sleeping bag was on a metal floor, but he was so knackered after the last few days that he closed his eyes and was instantly asleep. James first thought the banging was some prank by Sebastian and Clark. Clark lit his torch. "What is that?" James asked. Someone was thumping on the outside of the van. "Open up in there! Police!" Clark shone the torch on the back of Sebastian's head. Clark laughed. "Oh, nothing wakes him up. I set a firework off next to his ear once, and he didn't even budge." Clark got out of bed wearing shorts and a t-shirt and unlocked the door. 2 powerful torches pointed in his face. A policeman grabbed Clark out of the van and turned his torch on James. "Boy," the policeman shouted to James, "get out of there now." James put his bottoms and boots on with his free arm and stepped out. Fort Harmony was ablaze with flashing blue lights and torch beams. Police in riot gear were dragging everyone out of their huts. Kids were crying. Residents and police shouted at each other. The policeman knocked James against the van beside Clark. "Anyone else in there?" one policeman shouted. "My little brother," Clark said. "I'll go and wake him up." "No, you don't. I'll do it," the policeman said. One policeman stepped into the van. James spoke to the other one. "What's going on?" "Court order," the policeman said. He pulled a piece of paper out of his pocket and read from it. "By order of the High Court, all residents of the community known as Fort Harmony shall leave within 7 days. dated 16th of September 1972. That's over 30 years ago, James said. The policeman shrugged. It took us a bit longer than expected. The policeman inside the van screamed. He staggered out, holding his thigh. James spotted the glint of Sebastian's hunting knife sticking out of his leg. The other policeman shouted into his radio. Code 1, Code 1, officer down, serious injury. About 10 cops came swarming over. 2 grabbed the cop with the knife in his leg and carried him off. 2 slammed James and Clark hard into the side of the van and started searching them for weapons. Not those 2. There's a kid in the van, a policeman said. Clark shouted out. I said I'd wake him up for you. He's scared of the dark, so he sleeps with the knife beside him. Shut your hole before I shut it for you, a policeman said. 6 policemen surrounded the door of the van. 3 of them had guns drawn. Get out here, now, a sergeant shouted. Sebastian shouted from inside. Don't shoot me! Put the guns away! Put them down. He's only a kid, the sergeant said. What's your name, son? Sebastian? Sebastian, I want you to come slowly out of the van with your hands in the air. We know it was an accident. We won't hurt you. Sebastian stepped into the torchlight. When he got near the door, the police grabbed him and slammed him into the mud. 1 cop put his boot on Sebastian's back and locked on handcuffs. He looked tiny compared to the policemen all bulked out by riot gear. They dragged Sebastian off to a police car. Let me go with him, Clark said. A policeman slammed Clark against the van again. You don't learn, do you? The policeman said. Sebastian's mum was dragged out of her hut and put in the police car with her son. What about us? James asked. We're taking everyone to the church hall in the village. There's a coach at the bottom of the hill, the sergeant said. I need to get my tracksuit and boots, Clark said. You can't go in there. It's a crime scene. I'm barefoot, Clark said. It's freezing. I don't care if you've got to walk across broken glass, the policeman shouted. Get down to that coach or you'll have more than cold feet to worry about. James and Clark walked off. I've got to find my sister and Auntie Kathy, James said. Police were everywhere. Over 100. A chain of residents was heading down the hill. Anyone who put up a fight found the riot cops weren't shy about pulling batons. James and Clark dodged into some trees and re-emerged beside Kathy's hut. There was no sign of Amy, Kathy, or the Land Cruiser. They went in the hut. Amy and Kathy had taken most stuff with them. What are you looking for? Clark asked. My mobile, James said. Looks like my sister took it with her. What shoe size are you? 2? James kicked a pair of his Nikes into the middle of the floor. Those are a 3. You'll grow into them. Take whatever clothes you want. Cheers, Clark said. Clark put on tracksuit bottoms and trainers. James found him a warm top with a hood. My sister's probably down at the village, James said. Might as well get on the coach. James and Clark sat next to each other on the coach. It gradually filled up with residents, all of them carrying what they could. Clark was trying to hide how upset he was from James, but couldn't hold himself together. He's only 10. They'll realise it was an accident, James said. Don't bet on it, Ross. The cops will switch their stories around so he gets done. Whose story are they going to believe? A couple of kids who are always in trouble, or the police? I'll be a witness, James said. If Sebastian gets sent away, I'll stab a cop myself so I can stay with him.